Assalamu alaikum. Looking into post-structuralism and deconstruction, we saw how post-structuralism seems to have originated from structuralism, and whether we wondered whether it was a continuation or rebellion with a rebellion against structuralism. And having seen that, we realized that we've been thrust into a decentered universe, which in turn had created a certain kind of anxiety about language. And we saw this anxiety, and we saw how we reveal this anxiety through through the medium of communication, how uncertain we are of what we say and what we write or what we even think, right? We are not ever sure, and if we are sure, mind me, it is never right. It's rarely right. Anyway, we saw also certain theoretical differences between structuralism and post-structuralism through their origins, the tone of style and attitude to language, and also the aims of each. Then, looking into the life on a decentered planet, what we saw was how it originated. The idea of post-structuralism, where it originated in 1960s in France, and basically we started off with trying to understand Barthes's position in the post-structuralist realm. We saw how he moved from being a structuralist to a post-structuralist through his two works, The Structural Analysis of Narrative and The Pleasure of the Text. Also, we looked into his work, The Death of the Author, which seems to have acted as a kind of a declaration of independence for the text itself, right? And it seems to have freed the text from all forms of textual authority. So once it has become totally free, totally absolutely independent, we see Barbara Johnson as curbing, or rather bringing in a certain orderliness to the chaos and giving it a certain textual republicanism instead of textual permissiveness, right? And with her statement that it's not a hedonistic abandonment of all restraint but a disciplined identification, dismantling of the source of textual power, we get a brief understanding of how this deconstruction is not destruction. Deconstruction is not destruction. It is more more orderly practice, more of a step-by-step practice than just bulldozing through the text. Sorry for the analogy, but I couldn't think of a better word. Anyway, and through Jacques Derrida's Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, we saw how a certain intellectual event affected a radical break from the past ways of thinking with the help of Nietzsche and Heidegger's philosophy, along with Freudian psychoanalysis, and how and these were the instances, these were the events that contributed to the revolution brought about that broke our way of thinking earlier. So what we see is that instead of movement or deviation from a known center, we have a free play, because what the past way of thinking implied that the existence of a certain norm or a center for all things. Now, with these events, this center was destroyed. These centers were destroyed, and now with the absence of a center, we have absolute free play. So it is liberating, and this liberation Barthes calls the demise of the author. And Nietzsche tells us not to turn away from this liberation, because we tend to be afraid of anything that is new and that cannot seem to be controlled. Okay, and in Nietzschean universe, what we find is that there are no facts, only interpretations, and he asks us to be happy or rejoice in this, um, you know, this factless universe. Considering Derrida's deconstructive reading, we saw some three of his books, Speech and Phenomena of Chromatology, Writing Indifference. Please bear in mind that Derrida wrote some 40 books, of which all of them are more philosophical in nature than linguistic. So, in Of Chromatology, Peter Barry points out this one particular line, there is nothing outside the text, which has been variously misconstrued or sometimes very rightly used by various critics. And he asks us to skip through them all and go directly to the source itself, where we are shown that Derrida writes this line in this context, in the context wherein he's interpreting Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages, and he questions his own method of interpreting the text and nature of all interpretations. Because when we interpret something, we are replacing the reality with language. So language seems to be standing in the place of reality. So he wonders what is the nature of the standing in that the language does, and we realize that language seems to be a built system, an already ready-made system with its own history, philosophy, and so on. And when we enter it, we do not express ourselves in words, but merely some aspects. Okay, and no matter what language or what logic the writer writes in, the writer cannot dominate this discourse absolutely. So we then come to the understanding that reading and interpretation are not merely reproducing, as we have been led to believe. Generally, when we try to read a book, or when we try to interpret a text, what we do is we try to reproduce what the writer must have intended, what the writer must have thought, what the writer wants to express in the text. So this is an inadequate notion according to Derrida. He believes that it is merely a doubling commentary, because already it has been said by someone and you're just repeating, as if like I am doing a doubling commentary of the PPT right now, the slides I'm presenting, I'm just doubling the commentary, right? So this reproducing is inadequate. He wants to do he wants us to make a critical reading of the text, which should produce this text, because there is nothing behind it for us to reconstruct. Because see, the author is dead, right? There is nothing behind the text. Once the text has been liberated from the author, the text exists independently. So there is nothing behind it. There is nothing beyond it. So you cannot rely on the author anymore. You have to forget the writer now. So you are going to merely produce the text rather than reproduce the text. That is why he says there is nothing outside the text. Now, speaking of it all, he continues the idea that beyond and behind what one believes can be circumscribed as Rousseau's text, there has never been anything but writing. So there is nothing. You have to forget Rousseau and simply wonder at the writing itself. So what opens meaning and language is writing is a disappearance of natural presence. So let us look into the three Derridian ways of philosophy. I've asked you to look into it yourself. I believe you have come up with some ideas. But so far we have seen a little bit, or at least some understanding of what deconstruction is. But to understand deconstruction, I suggest you to look into Derrida's own life a little bit. Even though he does not make any references, any autobiographical references in any of his works, it still behooves us to look into his life a little bit to understand where did this concept come from, where did this originate. Okay, so you see, Derrida lived as a Jew in Algeria that was occupied by France, and as being part of the minority, he was excluded from all institutions. Okay, he was segregated. He was he was subjected to all the exclusionary measures taken by the Vichy government back then. Now, later on, what we see is that he, as a very brilliant, very intelligent student, he is still at odds with the institution, because when he goes to France, where he finds himself again an oddball, because despite the charms and the charisma that later on really helped his personality, they helped his popularity, at the initial stage he found himself quite removed from the workings, from the mainstream, you could call it, for lack of a better word for me. See, it is what you see is his understanding of deconstruction tells you that it is merely a dismantling of our excessive loyalty to any idea. When you are deconstructing something, it is merely a dismantling, as in, like, bit by bit removing the I mean, it's not merely speaking of having certain inclination, having certain loyalty. It's excessive loyalty, excessive adherence. It's when you say you strongly believe in something. So this strong belief is what he wants to dismantle to any idea, and learning to see the aspects of truth that might be buried in its opposite. Okay, he wants us to dismantle whatever excessive loyalties we have towards a certain idea, and to look for certain truth in its opposing idea. Okay, something that might be there but you are blind to it out of some prejudice or some conditioning, preconditioning. Right, in Of Grammatology he uses Western philosophers ideology and systematically who had systematically privileged speech. Okay, they seem to regard speech as something that is as a form of authentic communication, whereas writing seems to be a mere transcript of what people might say, a second-hand report, lacking the interaction and truthfulness that comes from conversation. Now, this privileging of speech over writing should not make any difference. I mean, it's not something you need to worry about. But based on this claim is his own overarching ambition to advance a vast and troubling proposition. Almost all our thinking is riddled with a false, unjustified, and unhelpful privileging of one thing over another. We find that we are always at odds with something or the other. We find that we always seem to prefer the light, or sometimes always prefer the dark, or sometimes we always see in simple generic case. He speaks of how speeches of always seems to be during his time, speech seems to be always privileged over writing, reason over passion, men over women, words over pictures, sight over touch, right? This privileging, no, male over female, I said men over women, right? So this privileging he is against. Okay, he wants us to rethink, and he wants us to dismantle our suppositions concerning this privilege. What causes this privileging of one over another? He wants us to rethink and deconstruct. We fail to see the merits and values of the lesser part of the equation. So it is not this, his idea is not nihilistic. Nihilistic as in he does not say that everything is worthless. Okay, he tries to find worth in even those things that seem worthless, right? So neglected counterparts in some of our key oppositions are worthy of love and attention. That is what he wants us to realize. Okay, now for instance, consider this: profit versus generosity, masculine versus femininity, as I said, reason over passion, or in high culture versus low culture. He wants us to learn to live more intelligently. Some of the conflicts that lay beneath these terms, what he realizes, what he makes us understand, is that both sides were onto something, both are a bit wrong, and both need each other. The tension between them are irrevocable. You cannot equate either of those. You cannot equate masculinity with femininity. You cannot equate. You cannot say they are different levels, but they are two very different things. So it is wrong to privilege one over the other, right? So to deconstruct an idea is to show that it's confused and riddled with logical defects, and we must keep its messiness constantly in mind. No, we should not try to overcome the confusion much. Try to have hard and fast rules, because living in this confused state of mind, according to Derrida, is fine. He criticizes our tendency to imagine that behind every problem there lies somewhere a good and neat solution. There are no hard and fast solutions. There are no good and neat solutions for everything under the sun. Yes, you may get arbitrary, very temporary answers, but those answers are not in permanent nature. You cannot find them like answering all your questions all the time. But we offer him a creature that is destined to live our lives without any clear answers, and craving for these answers is what is lies at the root of our troubles. So he wants us to get rid of the crude simplicity and to make us feel comfortable with permanently oscillating nature of wisdom. See, wisdom would be something that you are not always sure of. You could, for say, at one point of time, or at one stage in your life, something may seem to make sense. The same thing at another point of time, at another stage in your life, you might feel utterly ridiculous because your priorities change. So, with wisdom does not imply that it has to be consistent. Wisdom has to change accordingly, according to the situation, to time, space, everything, right? So, we have to be comfortable with this oscillating nature of wisdom. So, he argues that we might be rightly confused about the merits of capitalism or socialism or any of those things we consider, ills of the society, things that brought down the society. But there might be something very good about capitalism as well. Okay, I'm not a proponent of capitalist society, but still, he feels, Derrida feels that instead of outright calling it sinful, there might be something splendid about capitalism. Why not look at that? Okay, so there might be useful things to be said about both sides. And to avoid grappling with the fraud or kaleidoscopic nature of reality, we need to be uncertain or confused about, being about certain things. It's okay to be confused and uncertain about certain things, and being in this state is not going to be a weakness or vulnerability for us, because when we say that I am not very sure about it, we tend to show that we are not we're not we don't have a what could you call it, prioritized, or we have not thought it out. It could be, on the contrary, very well thought out. you know Anyone who arrives at a judgment, a conclusion very fast, may not have thought out things properly, may not have really looked at it from all angles. So instead of calling a confused person weak or stupid, he says it is a mark of maturity. When a person is unsure, when a person is uncertain, he calls it a mark of maturity. Rather, and not see, it's merely a philosophy, and yes, how you can take it with a grain of salt. Okay, and I personally believe there is a certain truth to it. Anyone who calls something outright sinful or shameful may be lacking insight, according to me. Anyway, now this confused state we're talking about is he calls it an aporia. Okay, the second part, aporia. So it is basically an impasse or puzzlement, a state we should feel proud to know, and a state we should visit on a regular basis, because he feels that it is something that we often need to get into, because the very idea of confusion and doubt is not embarrassing for him, because it's not embarrassing dead ends in a dead end world. It is the evidence of adulthood of mankind. It is the evidence of maturity of a person. In turn, he speaks of how logocentrism. Now, logocentrism would simply put mean the word at the center. Now, here the word has a very large, wider connotation, by which you could say, you could include reason, logic, or meaning, semantics, everything. So if you're going to put reason, logic, and meaning into the center, what happens is that you tend to become too fixated, okay? Too fixated on a very uncertain system that doesn't give you clear answers. See, we understood how there is language is quite uncertain, is unreliable, how it is liquid, right? So applying the theory to logocentrism, what we realize is that that we tend to have an over hasty, naive devotion to reason, logic, and clear definition, underpinned by a faith in language as the natural and best way to communicate. We tend to believe that language is the best way to think and communicate, best way to communicate as such, but it is not so, right? So this all these ideas, apart from the others we may look into later, is at the core of Derridian way of thinking. Now, even see, for example, consider this this part called IQ. This practice of measuring a person's IQ, intelligence quotient. So what you do is, when you are measuring someone's IQ, you are looking into the level of intelligence of that person. So how do you measure a person's IQ? You look into whether that person is capable of solving some puzzles, some riddles, some look into some geometrical sequence and come up with a solution. This is what we're concerned with. But the IQ does not, it fails to solve other puzzles. I mean, the other qualities of mind. It ignores the other qualities of mind. It doesn't mean, it doesn't measure the ability or capacity for friendship or parenthood or for having fun, or it does not ensure success. I mean, success, academic success, yes, but can it ensure having a good IQ? Can it measure a person's marital success? Can it ensure a person to succeed in his businesses, in networking, in just simply having fun in a holiday, at a party? No, an IQ cannot do all of that. So see, logic and reason can only go this far. So you cannot hold the word at the center. You cannot hold reason and logic at the center. Okay. Also, I want you to remember that he did not deconstruct all hierarchies. Okay, for instance, now this binary between kindness and cruelty. He did not want to he totally agrees that kindness has to be the privileged one here. For instance, wit and dullness. He believes, yes, wit is privileged over dullness, and it is rightly privileged. Generosity and meanness. He does not want to deconstruct, dismantle the idea of generosity. He does not want to find anything nice about being mean. Yeah? So when you look at any philosophy, not merely Derridian philosophy, I suggest you to take it with a grain of salt, always. So considering the structuralism and post-structuralism, the practical differences, we have seen some theoretical differences. Considering the practical differences as in how they differ in application, we see that it is attitude of mind rather than a practical method of criticism. It is more an approach and an orientation. And the task of a post-structuralist literary critic is to deconstruct the text. And what is deconstruction? It is applied post-structuralism, reading against the grain, reading against the text itself. Please do bear this in mind. What is deconstruction? Simply put, it is reading against the grain. So we saw deconstruction. When I spoke about deconstruction here, it was mainly the philosophy which led to the linguistic methodology of interpreting a text, right? So here we are looking at it from a linguistic perspective, or from a literary perspective, critical perspective. What we are doing is, when we speak of deconstruction, we are reading the text against the text itself. So what is the purpose of deconstruction? To know the text as it cannot know itself. See how interesting it is. The idea that the text does not know what it contains. Isn't it amazing? Just try looking at it from this angle. You'll find every text seems to say so many different things at each reading. Result uncovers the unconscious dimensions of the text, things which its over-textuality glosses over, or fails to recognize. So it is merely an attitude of mind, and the task of the post-structuralist literary critic is to deconstruct the text, and deconstruction is nothing but reading the text against itself. And why the deconstructionist deconstructionist does this practice makes this practice is to know the text as it cannot know itself, and the result, the consequence, is that it uncovers the unconscious dimensions of the text. Unconscious dimensions, as in things that are not overt, things that are hidden, things which the overt textuality glosses over. The overt textuality, the text itself seems to hide it and fails to recognize. Example, we have dealt with this example already, is in the word guest, how its cognate host seems to go on to hostess in Old English, which meant enemy. So there is a double aspect created by this word. When you look at its etymology, what you see is that there is two aspects. The conscious would be welcome, the unconscious would be, or the repressed or the unconscious idea here is the unwelcome. So the text, when it mentions the word guest, it may mean both. It may on the surface mean that the person is welcome, whoever the guest is welcome, and in the other sense we realize it is also unwelcome because of its having its origin. For instance, if you I don't know if you have read The Birthday Party, you may realize, you may be able to apply this thought to that particular work, especially this reference, how the guests are welcome but still very, very unwelcome. Or even Falstaff in Henry the Fourth, I think, yeah, Henry the Fourth, Part 2, I believe, wherein he speaks of his belly. Yeah, he calls it his womb. Whereas in Old English, whereas in Shakespeare English during Shakespeare's time, the womb actually meant stomach without any gender connotations to it. But a modern day connotation would imply a womb is specifically applied to the female gender, right? So there is a certain effeminate quality brought about in the text by the text itself without the text knowing about it. So what a deconstructionist reading of the Henry the Fourth would be like. Okay, I think we'll be talking about this later on. So I'll stop it here. No, we'll just do a little bit more. So we have certain definitions. Okay, definitions from Barbara Johnson, Jacques Derrida, and J.A. Cudden. We'll just skim through this one. So deconstructive reading must always aim at a certain relationship. So we are talking not merely about what deconstruction is, we are talking about deconstructive reading here. So it must always aim at a certain relationship, unperceived by the writer, between what he commands and what he does not command of the patterns of language that he uses. It attempts to make the not seen accessible to sight. So deconstructive reading, what should it do? It should make a relationship, construct a relationship between things that the writer writes and things he does not intend to write. Okay, and the purpose of deconstructive reading is to make the not seen accessible to sight, make the covert part of the text accessible to everyone. As far as Barbara Johnson is concerned, it's not synonymous with destruction. As I said earlier, destruction is different from deconstruction. Destruction is blindly done. It's like bulldozing into the text. We're not doing that. Closer to the original meaning of the word analysis, which etymologically means undo. So analysis simply means undo, right? It has its origin in the idea or thought of undo. So deconstruction is nothing but analysis. The deconstruction of a text does not proceed by random doubt or arbitrary subversion, but by the careful teasing out of warring forces of signification within the text. All right? And as far as J.A. Cudden is concerned, to him, deconstructive reading would be something like this. A text can be read as saying something quite different from what it appears to be saying. It may be read as carrying a plurality of significance or as saying many different things which are fundamentally at variance with, contradictory to, and subversive of what may be seen by criticism as a single stable meaning. Thus, a text may betray itself. deconstruction practices, there is a textual harassment or oppositional reading that has to be done. Okay, the main practice of a deconstructionist is to harass the text and do an oppositional reading, as in read against the text, right? Read against the grain. Yeah. The aim is to unmask internal contradictions or inconsistencies in the text to show the disunity which underlies its apparent unity. You would find this is in exact opposite to structuralist idea or structuralist practice. They try to find unity underlying apparent unity. Whereas a deconstructionist, what they do is they look for disunity underlying apparent unity. So there is unity in the text, but through certain things, certain words or certain phrases, a post-structuralist critic or a deconstructionist critic would try to find some discordant chord. He would show how the text seems to be, contradicting itself. The process. It will fix on a detail of the text which looks incidental. Okay, it just seems to be incidentally in passing. It is not highlighted. The presence of a particular metaphor, for instance, and then use it as a key to the whole text so that everything is read through it. So you see that a certain part, a particular metaphor, a certain word is fixed upon, and that seems to be the key for the whole text. So we have a table showing exactly the differences between structuralist and post-structuralist. Please look very carefully. Structuralists, they look for parallels and echoes. Remember how we saw the oval portrait, analyzed from a structuralist perspective? Yes, we saw certain parallels. We tried to establish parallels. We found echoes of one instance in another within the text. Whereas the post-structuralists, they look for contradictions. They look for paradoxes, right? Again, it balances shifts, or the structuralist tries to balance one part of the text with the other, or the structuralist critic would try to balance all parts together. Whereas the post-structuralist, they look for shifts, breaks in tone, viewpoint, tense, time, person, attitude, everything. Okay, a post-structuralist tries to find shifts and breaks, while the structuralist looks at reflections and repetitions. The post-structuralist look for conflicts, right? And while structuralist looks at symmetry, post-structuralists look for absences, omissions, lack of a presence. Okay, I haven't mentioned lack of a presence here because Barry does not, but that's the point. That's also another interesting point to be made. Contrast. Structuralists look for contrast. See, contradictions are different from contrasts. Okay, they try to bring in contrast, whereas post-structuralists look for linguistic quirks. I mean, they are not necessarily orderly contrasts. Patterns. They look for patterns here. They try to establish patterns. They try to reason out everything. Whereas post-structuralists are okay with aporia. They're happy with aporia. So the final effect is to show textual unity and coherence, and the post-structuralist effect is to show textual disunity. So what post-structuralist critics do? There are some 5 points here. First, they read the text against itself to expose the textual subconscious. We've already dealt with this, the idea that you need to look into the textual subconscious, where meanings expressed are contrary to the surface meaning. Whatever the text means on the surface, you try to find the contrary meaning expressed in the textual subconscious. Secondly, they fix upon the surface features of the words. Surface features of the word. They look into the surface. They just simply, stick to the surface features, as in similarities in sound, the root meanings of words, a dead or dying metaphor, as in the case of Falstaff, as I said, and bring these to the foreground so that they become crucial to the overall meaning. They show that the text is characterized by disunity rather than unity. They show that the text itself is characterized by disunity. They concentrate on a single passage, or it is mentioned single passage. It could be or a single phrase or a single page. Okay, depends. They concentrate on a single passage and analyze it so intensively that it becomes impossible to sustain a univocal reading, and the language explodes into multiplicities of meaning. When we say univocal meaning, there is no one meaning you could glean from that one particular passage. Okay, so when you do it intensively, when you do an intensive reading of a particular passage in the text, you end up having multiplicities of meaning. Look for shifts and breaks, fault lines, as in like geometrical lines, wherein some tremor or some earthquake must have occurred, or the tectonic plates, where you find how a certain a line has occurred to show where the effect has, where the break has been. So you look for shifts and breaks of various kinds in the text and see these as the evidence of what is repressed or glossed over or passed over in silence by the text. You find out through particular words, particular phrases, particular metaphors, puns, allusions. You look at these points and try to figure out that this is where certain, certain evidence, whatever evidence is required to show the contradictions in the text, has been glossed over. You look for those fault lines. This is all for today. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow. Allah Hafiz. Stay safe and be happy. Assalamu alaikum.